Well now, BookTube, it's a Thursday in October, so brace yourselves for a Victober Poetry Thursday crossover video. Now, when us 21st century folk think of Victorian literature and what we're going to read in October, say, but just Victorian literature generally, the first things that come to mind tend to be novels, and we go to those great Victorian novelists, and that's fair enough because it was the golden age of the English novel, I think, the 19th century. So that's okay. But if you were to sort of time travel back to somewhere in the mid-19th century and grab a few Victorian readers, men and women, and say to them, who do you think are the greatest writers of your age? I would put good money on the majority of them naming Victorian poets rather than the Victorian novelists that we now think of first. So when I'm doing my choosing for Victober, I do like to fit a bit of Victorian poetry in there too, to have a sense of what the Victorians read, as well as what we think of when we think of Victorian literature. And this year, I'm spending a bit of time with the Victorian poetry power couple, the Brownings, and that's Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning. Now, just say you did your straw poll of Victorian readers in, say, 1850. There is, it's probably unlikely that any of them would have picked Robert Browning as one of their top handful of writers of the age. He'd already had some success by then, but he was in a bit of a lull, and his big period of renown came a bit later in the 19th century. The one that there's a very good chance that they would have picked in, say, 1850 is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. 1850 was the year William Wordsworth died. He was the poet laureate at that point, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning was a distinct contender for becoming the poet laureate at that point. The role actually went to Tennyson, and we had to wait a whole lot longer for our first woman English poet laureate, or British poet laureate. But that's another story. So, what about Elizabeth and Robert? So, both poets, they actually came together through poetry. That's what brought them into contact. As I say, Elizabeth was probably the more successful of the two earlier, and one of her sort of high points was the edition of her poems that came out in 1844. And Robert Browning, who was about 6 years younger than her, so she was born in 1806. He was born 6 years later. He, as a young poet, really admired Elizabeth's work and wrote to her to tell her so. And a mutual friend, Kenyon, arranged for them to meet in, I think it was 1845, and they kind of hit it off and started exchanging letters, and things developed from poet to poet friendliness to a romantic relationship, which they kept secret because Elizabeth knew that her father would disapprove. But ultimately they decided to get married, got married in secret, and then went to live abroad, briefly in Paris, and then in Florence and Siena in Italy. So and were happily together until she died in 1861, and a relatively early death. While they were courting, as it were, this secret relationship, she wrote a group of a sequence of sonnets, 44 of them, that were about that love affair. as it were. Now, the interesting thing about these sonnets is that they were not written for publication. She wrote them for herself. She didn't even share them with Robert at the time when she was writing them in 1845, 1846, just before up until the time they got married. She actually didn't show him the poems until after they were married. When he read them, he said, these are too good to just be private to us. They should be published. But she was hesitant because she felt they were very personal. And when you read them, boy, they are very personal as love poems, and a woman's thoughts about a developing love affair. So she agreed to publish them, but under the name Sonnets from the Portuguese. And the idea of that was that it would sort of imply that they weren't her original material exactly, that they were sort of adaptations of Portuguese originals. So 44 sonnets. I love a sonnet. The thing about a sonnet is because it's a kind of restricted and very specific form, it kind of forces a poet to fit their ideas in a succinct way. You read a sonnet and you think, how much can they pack in terms of ideas and emotions or language into this little 14 line specific structure. So one of the things that really struck me, and also I should say that I read all 44 of the Sonnets from the Portuguese as my sort of Victober poetry reading. One of the things that really struck me reading them is that although they are love poetry, they're not necessarily love poetry in the sense of declaring your love to another. One of the things that runs through them is a very, quite striking sense of Elizabeth's self-doubt or a poor self-image, I suppose we'd call it now, in a sort of bodily self-image, I guess. She doesn't doubt her intellectual abilities or her artistic abilities, but she really doubts herself as a woman that someone might fall in love with, might want to have a romantic or physical relationship with. Now, part of the reason for that may well be because of her ill health. So she became a bit of an invalid from the age of about 12. There's lots of theories about what it may have been that was wrong with her. But then she consistently took laudanum to deal with the pain, and that will also have affected her health and well-being. And then it appears she probably had tuberculosis as well. So although she was a prolific writer, she was, lived quite the quiet life of the semi-invalid, and she obviously really sort of didn't feel that good about herself, her physical self, even if she felt good about her soul or her brain, as it were. That's quite hard to read, I found now. There's a sort of confessional element that, reading them as a woman, I found, that's sort of tricky, that sort of self-deprecation that you get in the sonnets. On the other hand, there's some wonderful poems in here, and one of the poems in the collection is one, number 43, is one that is very frequently anthologized, and is the one that probably most people are most likely to have heard of. It's the sort of poem that turns up in things like, the nation's favourite poems. And if I read you the first line, you might recognise it. So it's, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach. And so it goes on. It's a beautiful, absolutely beautiful poem. A real, declaration of love poem. But most of them are a little different from that. And I'm going to read you number 14, which is also, I think, a very beautiful and meaningful poem about love. But you can also, if you listen carefully, you will hear that sort of thread of self-doubt or self-deprecation in this one more clearly. Okay, number 14. If thou must love me, let it be for naught except for love's sake only. Do not say, I love her for her smile, her look, her way of speaking gently, for a trick of thought that falls in well with mine, and certes brought a sense of pleasant ease on such a day. For these things in themselves, beloved, may be changed, or changed for thee, and love so wrought may be unwrought so. Neither love me for thine own dear pities wiping my cheeks dry. A creature might forget to weep who bore thy comfort long, and lose thy love thereby. But love me for love's sake, that evermore thou mayst love on through love's eternity. Well, isn't that a stunner? I'm also reading some Robert Browning during and beyond Victober. The Ring and the Book, which he started working on whilst he was married to Elizabeth, but was published sometime after her death, and was probably his most highly regarded work at the time. And I'm reading this with Jennifer Brooks and Victober host Kate Howe, and I will hope later in Victober to do a video about the first couple of it's an epic poem, and about the first 2 books in this epic. So roll on that, and I hope you're reading some lovely things from Victober, including some Victorian poetry.